Focus today is going to be, it's hard to get a title for this one. It's about the Agile process and Agile development. We'll talk about it, do an introduction into it, and then talk about some things I've learned on. And a lot of this is not only from experience, but also from others that I've talked to, sort of some best processes and just the practices and just thinking about it's a little bit different mindset with Agile. And it seems like it's one of those things that's a buzzword that's used way too often, as opposed to thinking about how it actually works in the real world. So the subtitle of this is really making the most of this approach, is not just Agile for sake, but taking advantage of what Agile actually offers us as a software development process. Now, stepping back a little bit to just set the stage for what Agile is. Agile started many, many years ago. The whole idea of it was, and actually it was a little bit before, but if you go Google the Agile Manifesto, then you will find a page that describes what Agile is intended to be. And that's this first quote is, quote, "We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. That is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more." And if you think about it, after you've gone through a project or two, that all makes sense. That all of those pieces, they're all, the 8 things, the left and right of each of those 4 statements are important, but there is that greater to the things on the left than there are to the right. For example, following a plan is not as important as responding to some changes. And particularly in software, we all know that it's just like the old quote about, as soon as you go to war, then all your plans you can just throw them out. As soon as the battle starts, it's time to start reacting, basically. Sort of the same thing with software. We see stuff changing so much that we can't just set a plan and say, all right, come hell or high water, we're going to do it. There's going to be changes. Now, deeper, there's a series of points, if you look on that page, of what Agile software is. And I'm not going to read through all of these because you can see there's a lot to it, but these are really the principles of Agile development. And if you look, just even a glance, you'll see that there's some words that come out like continuous and efficient and simplicity and maximizing, which are all those kinds of words that you would expect from something to say, yes, you can do it this way, but there's a better way. And the gist of these is that communication and responding and sort of doing are we there yet, or is this what you mean kind of approach to development works better than, okay, I think I know what you want. I'm going to go off and build something. I'm going to come back and then give it to you and then say, is this it? The micro changes and the smaller changes are going to be better than doing these huge course corrections. And so that brings us to the meat of the presentation, I guess. We're going to talk about really embracing and making the most of Agile. And through these, we're going to talk about the 80-20 rule. We're going to look at the fact that we don't know what we don't know. We're going to talk about incremental change and momentum, reducing your next version cost, windows of opportunity and embracing those, and then essentially the idea of self-documentation is allowing the process to document itself as opposed to making documentation a part of the process. So first off is the 80-20 rule. Just to sort of back up on what that is, it's also known as the Pareto Principle, Pareto. The idea of this is that 80% of the effort goes into 20% of the solution. And similarly, 20% of the effort goes into 80% of the solution. That means that your best bet from a cost evaluation is to aim for an 80% solution, if that's satisfiable. 80% of an open heart surgery is not enough. You can't just say, oh, well, we got mostly there, so we're just not going to sew them up or something like that. However, in software in particular, it is not uncommon for 80% solution to be sufficient. Actually, probably less than that, because we have the whole idea, as we've discussed before, of a minimal viable product. That may only be 20% of the solution. There may be some huge solution you're building where just a couple pieces of it are enough to move the ball forward, to get you to the goals that you want to achieve. And thinking about that, if you're focused on the 80%, then that does leave room for change. That means that you're looking at this 80% as your core or your foundation. And then that other 20%, there's a lot you can do within that allows you to position your solution as needed or refine your solution as needed. And in the Agile approach, then you can do this in later sprints. If you can get 80% of your solution in a sprint in a period of time that you're working on the product, then you can come back later and say, okay, we're mostly there, but now we're going to put the finishing touches on. We're going to refine it. We're going to make it a little better. We're going to tune it. We're going to do all of those things that are that extra 20%, that last 20%. The best thing about this approach, it allows us to make progress while we're solving big problems. We talked about this when we talked about problem solving in general, and the idea is that get a solution, just any solution first. And usually the brute force, bull in a china shop kind of approach is going to be your quickest way to get it, whether it's manual, done by pencil and paper, or whatever it is. As long as you've got a problem and you have a solution, that's your first step, because then you can build on that. You can say, well, okay, here's a solution. Well, how can I get to that solution better? How can I automate it? How can I do all of the things that will make it a better solution? Another thing Agile really addresses that I think we underestimate too often outside of Agile, and I think Agile is starting to force more people to embrace this. However, there are still shops that don't, that are full bore, let's design, then we implement for a long time, then we test and we roll it out. Well, the key to this is you define and design what you know in an Agile process. You accept the fact that you will not know some things about the required solution. Now, yes, in a small problem, a small, short solution kind of thing, if you're able to create your product in a couple of days or a couple of weeks, then, and especially by definition almost, that problem is not going to be terribly complex, then you're going to know what your inputs and your outputs are and what your desired look and user experience. And then you can get through that and be confident that what you're building through all that, through that implementation period is what you want. However, when you start blowing that out into something larger, if it's going to be a year or 2 years or 5 years to get to your solution, then things are going to change. Whether maybe your problem and your requirements are not, but the technology platforms and things that are available to you will change. So from Agile, you look at that, you embrace the idea that, okay, we can do small stuff and be confident that what we're building is what we need. So for each sprint, you define and you design what you know based on your requirements that you know, get that 80%. And then with that remaining 20%, basically what you're doing is you're going to say, hey, there's some things that are yet to be defined. Or maybe I have some questions about how this should handle outlier cases or exceptions or different types of inputs and outputs, things like that. Put that in a to be determined list or to be defined list that says we're going to get to our 80%, but before we're going to go to that 20%, we're going to make sure we have these other things nailed down so we can properly design the rest of the solution. With that, you get to implement what you can, what you know, what you have defined. You can go in and start working on that. And then you push back on the customer or the owner the questions of the things that you don't understand or you don't know yet. A key in doing all of this is that while you're doing this 80% solution, you still need to design. You can't just jump into coding. Agile is not an excuse to skip design. Your design may not be a long period, but you still need to think about what you're doing. You still need to follow on a short scale all of the proper best practices for developing software. Most importantly, avoid coding yourself into corners. And we talked about this when we talked about writing good code and some best practices, avoiding things like hard coding values and stuff like that would maybe lock you into a specific path. And now down the road, you've done 80%, that 80% solution. What you don't want to do is have to go back into that 80% solution and re-architect it. There's going to be situations where you have no choice, where decisions made early on change. That's just the nature. Again, that's responding to change. But the more you think through your coding and your implementation, the better your design is likely to be, and thus you're less likely to code yourself into a corner and be a situation where you basically have to throw out work that you did before. Another great value of Agile is that it builds momentum. We talk all the time about moving forward, about having that forward momentum. Well, one of the things you can do is with each sprint, you're going to have visible goals and you're going to have some technical debt. You're going to have some requirements that have been put together, but there's also going to be some things that you did because you followed that 80-20 rule. You're going to have some things that you did that you would rather redo. We always do that. We do some code and we come back to it and we say, that really could be done better, because somewhere down the road, either the technology changed or the platform changed or our knowledge of how to solve the problem changed. And so for every sprint, you want to keep moving forward on those requirements. And ideally, although this is not as common, you want to keep reducing technical debt. You want to keep sort of touching that and find a way to keep that from snowballing out of control. Because if you do, or if you fail to do so, then you end up building a house of cards. And at some point, you've got too much, duct tape and all this other stuff, and it just falls apart. So maybe what you need to think about is use that 80-20 rule almost on your visible goals and technical debt. Maybe you push 80% of each sprint is moving forward on your requirements, but maybe you have 20% held back or 10% or something like that is addressed to just getting technical debt covered. And that would allow you to at least have some forward momentum on reducing technical debt. Hopefully, if it's 10 or 20% of each sprint is reducing and removing and refactoring to avoid technical debt, hopefully you're not building technical debt at a greater rate, and that allows you to keep something that's it's a small part of your application. Thus, if at any point you have to stop or be audited or the company gets bought or whatever, what you push out is actually not very, it's not bad. It's pretty well designed, and you can look at it and say, yeah, there's a couple things we'd like to clean up, but for the most part, it's where we want it to be. Now, another thing is with this momentum, you get to find your defined paths of moving forward and build those into each sprint as opposed to guessing. Because if we look at a requirement, we say, well, there's a couple questions we have about this. You can simply say, you know what, we're not going to tackle this right now, or at least there's pieces of it we're not going to tackle right now. And instead, we're going to push back. We're going to get clarification. We're going to do research or whatever needs to be done to really define that requirement and that path before we start going down there. When we're moving forward, as we're doing sprint after sprint, take a look for low-hanging fruit. There's going to be some things that are pretty well defined or are just part of doing software that you can tack those things into a sprint and continue to make forward progress. You can get those things completed, whether it's the things that you always do, like a login screen and forgot password functionality and connecting to databases and building some sort of object relational mapping layer if you need to. Interface related stuff and validation things like, okay, how do we validate a date or a phone number or a zip code or a social security number? Security related things. Those are all things that you basically know what they need to be. I mean, there may be a little bit of a nuance from application to application, but at the end of the day, you basically know what it is. It allows you to get it done and you keep moving forward. That means that each sprint period, when you get done, you can say, all right, we are further along towards a solution than we were when we started. You also can build some foundations and frameworks as you go if you need to. If you're looking at a layer, like a long list of requirements, and you see that you need to build, let's say, I don't know, a rules engine. You need to build like a really simplistic rules engine as part of building this solution. Well, it allows you in a sprint to say, okay, well, we're going to start building just this generic rules engine that will address our needs while we're waiting for some of these other requirements to be done. It's almost a low-hanging fruit, but you know, your foundations and frameworks, some of these bigger engines within a solution may actually take several sprints to get done, and even defining it may be almost a mini project in itself. And we do see this more often than not. Usually there's one or two big risks or big problems that need to be solved, and it almost requires some sort of a foundational engine or framework or something like that to get that piece done. And this is how you can move forward on that without waiting for all these other things to get done. It's like while you're waiting for the design to be done, hey, we can get some coding done as well. I highly recommend that when you're thinking about sprints and you're moving through your processes and cycle after cycle, sprint after sprint, this is very important to think about testing. Go ahead and build in, as again, much like you're doing with that technical debt, is maybe address your testing and infrastructure tools. And Agile does really sort of lend itself to that, because you are doing, at the end of each sprint, you are, if you're doing it right, you are testing and you're doing some deployments and other things that generally would make use of infrastructure type tools, scripts to push your code and update your database and do some sort of regression testing, hopefully. So Agile, ideally done right, ends with a really good full-featured environment to continue to maintain and enhance whatever that solution is. If you're doing it right, you're actually, chunking away at those big pieces of work every single sprint. And the last thing that I think I see it about half of it. Some places are very good at this, some are not. And it's the idea of telling a story with each sprint, having a sprint related goal, essentially. And that is, when I'm done with this sprint, here's a new feature or a use case or some use cases that I am going to address. So with each sprint, since you're going through it, and you don't have to do it with everyone, there will be occasionally a sprint where it's just, we just need to code a lot. There's not a whole lot we're gonna be doing here that's related to the users. It's an infrastructure, an internal, behind the scenes kind of a sprint. But usually, when in doubt, and unless you can't avoid it, or unless there's no other way to get around it, I think you need to have some sort of a story. It's with this sprint, we're going to do this. This is the feature we're focusing on with this sprint. This is the foundational piece. This is the problem that we're focusing on. And with each sprint, yes, there's some bigger things, but you've been able to break those big things down into smaller things in a sprint. So those pieces should tell some sort of story. There should be some relationship between those tasks for a couple of reasons. The first one, and we'll talk about a couple of others, but the first one is just so that when you talk to the non-technical people, the end users, the stakeholders, you can say, well, this is what we're doing in this sprint, without just saying, well, we're taking ticket 1 and ticket 15 and ticket 73 and we're fixing those. You have a almost an elevator speech of a minute or two that you can describe, this is what we're doing with the sprint, that makes sense to an end user. Related to this is getting rid of the whole, oh yeah, we're going to cover that in the next version, fear, we'll call it, that users often fall into. If you go to any big company that's done software for a while, you will find, depending on how they've done it, but a lot of cases you'll find that there's almost this fear or this acceptance of, if somebody says, well, we'll cover that in the next version, that you'll probably never see it fixed. We see this when we talk to software vendors. They'll be like, oh yeah, we'll fix that in the next vendor or the next version. And we're sitting there saying, I don't know that you will, because we get let down over and over again. They say they're going to fix it in the next version and then they don't. And because of that, we start saying, oh, great, we're just getting ignored. And, that turns into a negative view of the product itself. The nice thing about the Agile approach is that the next version comes very soon. It's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it is, but you're on this regular release cycle. And so the next version is something that they can look forward to. And because of its the definition, the small definition of what's in each version, each release, then you're going to be able to be a little more specific. So you can say, yes, this is something we're going to fix in the next version, or this is something we're going to cover 3 releases from now, because that's when we're going to swing back around to that. That allows you to deliver on your promises much better. Also, if you have big problems, if you have high priority bugs or issues, then you can push those right into the next sprint. You can say, all right, we got to do this immediately, so we're going to cover that in the next sprint. And this allows you to build organically or naturally have a priority to your tasks. With each version, you've got some things that are critical, that people are griping about, that people are saying, we can't wait 3 releases for this to be fixed. This also gives you, it should help you limit stretch goals a little bit. It allows you to say, okay, for each sprint, we're going to put some stuff into it, but we're going to also, that are key moving forward requirements, but we're also going to have some wiggle room. We're going to have some buffer that as we're looking for longer term things, when we're laying out roadmaps beyond 1 or 2 sprints and saying, here's when we're going to get this stuff done. As we start mapping that out a little bit and say, we're going to tell this story for sprint A and this story for sprint B and this story for sprint C, we're going to look at those and say, okay, there's certain requirements of tasks that have to be in each of those sprints. Well, we want to make sure that we leave a little wiggle room. And instead of really piling stuff into each sprint to get to the end, we're going to say, okay, let's leave a little bit of room for solving whatever bugs or problems come up. Similar to telling a story focus of a sprint, when we do this and we look at each version as a release and having that story, it allows us to focus our development. There may be a whole lot of pieces, and usually there's a whole lot of pieces and variations of code that need to be done to get a solution out the door. We may be focused on, there's database stuff, there's front end stuff, there's middle tier stuff, there's core engine solution stuff, there's user experience stuff. When we're telling a story and we're focused on each sprint as being a version, then it allows us to really focus our development for that period of time. That way we end up spending less time switching gears and the cost related to thinking about interface and then switching back to thinking about database stuff and then thinking about middle tier stuff. You get to go in, focus on something, whatever that factor or that facet or that story is, and then do that release and you move on to the next one. This also gives you it's almost a silver bullet to avoid a death march. Because what you end up doing is each sprint is in itself, yes, there may be a little up and down to it, but you end up over time leveling out your development. And although it may take you years to get a product done, since you're getting some sort of deliverable, some victory with each sprint, then you don't have that feel of a death march where you're just like coding and coding and working and working and working and nothing's ever done. You're seeing that progress is being made. And so you almost by its very nature defeat the idea of a death march and burning people out and all of the problems that can come with really large projects when they go awry. When you're thinking about the next version or the next sprint and addressing stuff within that framework, you want to watch out for big changes in usability. Well, actually, big changes and usability, I guess probably even a better idea is that sometimes you're going to make some big changes that are going to really, they're big swings from sprint to sprint in the end user experience. And this can make your end users just go nuts because something that was there suddenly isn't there, or there are a bunch of things new. There's a whole bunch of buttons or menu items or options that weren't there in the last one. And if you do that, you can do that here and there, but if every sprint is a very big change from the previous sprint, it can cause a negative impact to the users. So instead, find a way to do regular kinds of changes. So it's a little here, a little there. It's something that they can take advantage of and really just digest from sprint to sprint. If the changes made are those smaller bite-sized pieces, that allows the users to have some trust that yes, you're making progress and you're not going to cause them to completely have to redo the way they get their work done from sprint to sprint. Again, with that sprint approach, when you say we're going to get that in the next version or in 2 versions from now, it does allow you to set expectations, but also have a quick turnaround on fixes. So instead of that next version being 6 months from now or a year from now, and people saying, okay, I've got to find a workaround, I've got to find something else to do because I can't wait 6 months to get my job done. Instead, they can say, oh, okay, something's going to be, but there's going to be a fix for this in a couple of weeks. I can find a way to limp through or find some sort of short-term workaround instead of going out and getting a whole nother system or something like that. So you may have somebody that, they do something they have a little spreadsheet they use for a while and do it that way. But you don't have these situations where you've got departments that have got their own access applications or even little websites that are doing the job that really your primary product should be doing. And of course, going through all of this with this quick next version approach allows you to get some clarifications. You can put something in front of somebody. This is that communication side of Agile. Get it in front of them, get some feedback. If there's changes that need to be made, you can roll those, put those tickets up and roll them into a sprint or 2 ahead. This is back to that rapid application development approach where you're quickly turning stuff around, getting it in front of somebody, getting feedback, and then able to make those changes. You're more likely to get that than, again, trying to get everything from them, get them to understand exactly what everything's going to look like, do this huge amount of design up front, run away for a year, and then come back with the product. This approach also does very much lend itself to the idea of like shell solutions and clickable demos and things like that. You should have something that each release is put out there in front of users that does allow them something that they can see and that they can actually get some feedback on. Again, back to that whole story idea. You're telling a story with the sprint, then put that in front of the users at the end of it, and they should be able to agree that, yep, that's exactly how we want it to work, or no, it's not. We need some changes, and then you adjust and move forward. One of the biggest things about Agile, which is why I think so many places, besides just the idea of not having so much documentation, but why so many places adapt it, is that you have the ability to react quickly. You could have 6, 7, a dozen sprints sort of penciled out. But if the market suddenly changes, then you're able to say, okay, well, we're gonna change direction. There's these sprints we were going to do. We're not going to do those. We're not in motion with those. We don't have any momentum on those sprints necessarily. So we can change gears, redirect, and go react to whatever opportunities are out there. Maybe there's a feature that suddenly it makes a lot of sense for that feature to be a part of our product. Maybe it suddenly goes from this isn't going to be a viable product commercially for 6 months to this is actually going to be a viable product in a month because we have this feature that we can turn around quickly and provide. Thus, you now have some short-term goals and tools that you can maybe build as part of your process. And those are things to look at as you're building out sprint after sprint. Again, adjusting to market. Maybe you're now the first to market. Maybe you're building a financial application and suddenly this new PayPal-esque type of site comes out that everybody's flipping to it. Everybody's saying, oh, we want to have our transactions go through this site. Well, you may have had 6 other vendors that you were going to integrate with, but you readjust and say, we're going to integrate with this vendor. Well, now you may not have a full feature product, but maybe you've got that 80-20 rule. Maybe you got a product that's mostly there, but you are one of the few or the first one, the one and only that can integrate with the new platform. Suddenly you can get some eyeballs. You can get some people that are thinking, hey, maybe this is a product we should look at. You can also build on what you have. And this is where I've got an example in my own experience that worked out really well. Is that this is years ago, I worked with a consulting company that had a whole bunch of little tools and utilities that they had built. And that was turned into essentially a suite of software tools for developers for the platform. Well, on top of that, while we were building these tools, we being the software development team I was on, while we were building these tools, building out this commercial product that was really a collection of tools, utilities, and frameworks, and we turned it into a framework for developers. Well, while we were testing and building applications with that and finding some of our own pain points in developing in that language on that platform, we built these tools. So we looked at it as, hey, some things came up that said, it'd be nice to have another product. And since although this is before Agile, but we were sort of Agile-ish in the way we did stuff, we were able to spend basically about a long weekend. I think we started on like a Thursday. And by Sunday, we had the starts of that 80-20 rule. We had the starts of a whole other product. And it was in time to get it out to a conference and build some buzz about it, things like that. And that's what Agile will do for you. It allows you to say, hey, here's something we want to do. We've got a change in business goals or something like that. We want to get something out sooner rather than later. And sprint-wise, you can do that. You say, all right, well, maybe we can take what we've got and we can, within a sprint or two, take a couple of those pieces far enough along that now we have a product. So instead of us releasing a year from now, whatever it is, for whatever reason, we need to release sooner, well, we can release something sooner. We can have an MVP sooner than we would have if we were not doing that Agile approach and getting some points where we were completed along the way. The nice thing about Agile, if you do it right, is that it really almost documents itself. So at the end of the day, once you release that solution out to the wild, you could come back and have somebody build some really nice full documentation of everything, the technical side of it, the user side of it, all of that kind of stuff. Because along the way with each sprint, you should have some release notes that go out with each of those deployments. And within that, you're going to say, if you've done it right, there's this story. These are the features that we're bringing in. These are the problems we're solving. And then you're going to have with that some technical stuff. Maybe, here's some bugs that were fixed. Here's some enhancements and improvements that were made. at a more granular level than that, if it's done right, you should have some comments with your commits into version control that allow you to essentially see the story of how we built this thing. Here's some of the problems we ran into. Here's the problems that we solved. And whether it's within that, the commit comments, or maybe ticket related notes and discussions, still you should have them between those, and amongst all of those, you should have, these are the decisions we had to make, and these are the reasons why we decided to go the direction that we did. You're going to have, with each deployment, you're going to have known bugs. You're going to have some test results that have come out that said, here's some failures or other issues. So you're going to know what your issues and gaps are. When you're done and you release, you just roll all those things up and say, okay, here's our remaining known issues and kinds of things that we want to address in the next release. And you may still have some open questions and some things that are to be defined that are, again, back to that 80-20. Those open questions and those to be defined, those to be resolved kinds of issues are perfectly set up to be, these are what we want to do in our next version. We've gotten to version 1.0. We did all these sprints. We released a 1.0. When we want to know what 2.0 is going to be, we should naturally have a list of features that we want to address. And yeah, you're going to want to look at it, maybe add to it, but it definitely gives you a good starting point. So wrapping all of this up in a nice little bow or whatever, Agile, among other things, besides being buzzword and all that kind of stuff, this is a way to speed delivery of applications. This is a way to get you to something deployable, something sellable, something customers want, something reducing pain points sooner rather than later, because its focus is delivering. Its focus is deliverables. Its focus is not the process or anything like that. It is get something in front of somebody, get feedback, correct as needed, get them to a point where this is useful to them as soon as possible. Nevertheless, design and putting thought into your coding is still required. You can't just slap a bunch of tickets and requirements up on a Kanban board, have people code them and be done with it. There still needs to be some design and testing and all of those other facets of a complete software development lifecycle still need to be there. We're just adjusting how those look. I think the best thing in Agile, and it's why I do it personally, it's why I recommend it so many places, is it provides steady progress and allows for incremental change. You're putting something out on a regular basis. People are seeing, whether it's the team that's building it or it's the end users, they're seeing regular progress. They're seeing how things evolve. They're seeing that their input is valuable. They're seeing that their effort that is going into this process is paying off. Sort of like a 1A and a 1B. I think the other thing is that it does allow you to focus your work. It allows you, now in a big team, yeah, you may have groups that do only certain types of work at a given time, and there's not a lot of crossover. But once you get down to smaller teams, typically people are the same person is going to be doing different things. They're going to be working on front-end work or middle tier work or back-end work or testing focused work or performance tuning or whatever it happens to be. And there is a cost to switching gears in those different areas. There's just a mental, all right, I've got to think a little bit differently. I've got a different set of features and functions and things that I need to be thinking about. It's very different thinking about what are all of the pages that I'm working with and the construct of those pages, like the header and the footer and menus and stuff like that, versus, okay, now I'm in the middle tier and I'm thinking about these certain business objects and their properties and some of the functions and methods related to those. There's a cost to changing that mindset, and there's some efficiencies by being able to really focus. It's proven out over and over again. That's why the whole Pomodoro technique can be so effective, is because you say, all right, I'm going to focus on this thing for, the default 25 minutes. I'm not going to let anything distract me. And you're going to be amazingly productive doing so, because you're able to really go deep in getting that task done and not have to spend time switching gears. And so I guess now I'll open it up. Any questions, comments?
Hey there, Rob. This is Tim. Wanted to ask about maybe not so much of a question, more of a thought of discussion, or even a new presentation, a separate presentation. Just what does an agile release process look like? And again, a second facet of it, just agile QA. What does that kind of look like, and how would we integrate that into the agile development process as a whole? I'll say I don't particularly like my release or source control process. I use it and it works, but I know that there's some improvements. And just to kind of give some insight behind the question, I'd like to know what are some better ways of working source control in the agile process.
It's, I guess the first thing is a sprint typically should look almost like a small waterfall, as far as not the deliverables, but as far as the steps that are taken. There should be a requirements gathering, which may just be picking, it may be as simple as I'm choosing the issues that are going to be part within scope for this sprint. And then there should be a design period of some sort, maybe a few hours or a day, depending on what your sprint is, or a couple of days, depending on your sprint. But it's basically a period where we say, all right, we know what we're going to tackle. Let's make sure that we're grabbing these tasks and we're spending some time designing it. Well, how should this work? What should this look like? And then there's some implementation period to it, which you're always going to have. But then towards the end, you should have, like you would normally, there should be some testing. Now, ideally, testing is going on all through, but towards the end, you're really going to be, heavy testing. It's basically just as you would normally have. Somewhere in a sprint, there should be a code freeze, and then let's test that. Let's go beyond unit level and go to system level testing. And probably even within that, you should be testing your deployment. So, you're working on your development environment. You get to a code freeze. There should be a deployment to your test environment, and then test all these things that we've done in this sprint. And then there's a little bit of probably a brief cycle of, okay, here's the issues that are found, address what we need to address. Move forward to the next sprint, the things that we're not going to address in this one, do another deployment, and sort of essentially repeat the cycle. So there should be each of your normal things that you would expect. They just occur maybe a little more frequently. And in each case, you get to them a little faster, I guess is the way to put it, because you're not going to spend as much time necessarily up front. And really it's because of scale. If you think about it, you can dive in and create some tests for one feature a lot faster than trying to think about testing a huge system. You know what, you almost by looking at it, it's going to be much more apparent what the inputs, the outputs are. It's just like everything else. Smaller bites are always going to be easier. There's less preamble that needs to go into it. And so with that, now ideally even within a sprint, and this is where I think a lot of places run into a little bit of trouble, is figuring out how to make this work, because there is almost like a chicken and egg kind of problem. Ideally, what you would like to do with every ticket or every item that's on that Kanban board, what you'd like to do is be able to design it, code it, test it. Now it's a unit test, but you would like to have a system test sooner rather than later, so that thing fits with the system. However, the system's in flux during that sprint, so you can It's sort of limited what you can do. And that's where I think a lot of places find the biggest challenge is getting the testers testing sooner rather than later. And part of it also is actually getting the developers to get a task done and actually commit the code and have it ready for a tester to look at. Because sometimes I see this a lot is you'll have a sprint. Let's say you have a 2-week sprint. At the end of the first week, very few of the tasks are done. Very few changes have been committed. And then suddenly 2 days later, there's going to be a flurry of stuff that's committed. And it may be that there was a 6-day period of time that needed to be done to get that implemented. But there's times that's not the case. There's some little things that could be done that could be done, committed, and start testing sooner in the cycle rather than later.
Right.
And that's just a little bit, that's a mindset. A little bit of that is figuring out how to break up your tasks in a way that you can get them in, committed, and ready for testing sooner. And that's where you get into like continuous integration and some of those kinds of things where the push is to do daily commits of completed type tasks, no matter how, however small they need to be able to do so. And that would mean at the end of every day, you've taken a step forward with your system, and it allows your testers to run all of the regression tests, but then also create, work on the new tests for whatever the new functionality is from day to day to day. Does that give you a little more information? And
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I was gonna also ask regarding source control. I kind of plugged it in there. My process is every ticket or every issue has its own branch. That branch is then merged into the release branch. It's the release branch that's tested in the test environment. And then, of course, once it's, green flagged, it's deployed. And then, of course, the release branch is taken into the master branch. From there, the next release is branched off and so on and so forth. Is there a better way of doing that?
There may be. I think that basically is the way I do it. If I'm doing anything with a team, and particularly with a sprint, that there is still there's always going to be a little bit of challenge of being on that release branch, and I'm working on something and you're working on something, and we both need a little bit what the other one's doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of that merge kind of stuff, which is where the continuous integration, the daily builds can help. It allows you to have an environment that at least has progressed more for you to be able to integrate your code with the current system. But I find that to be best because that means I'm on a branch that I'm focused on again, it's that focus kind of thing. I'm on a branch that I've pulled from as recent as I can get. I'm making the changes that I need to make, and then I can commit those back, and then somebody's going to roll that into a release branch, and I'm going to be able to know, as part of that, they're going to merge it or they're going to kick it back to see me and say, hey, this is emerging, right? Can you make these couple of changes so we can merge it? That gives you that release branch that is your basically your sprint level version that you can work with. You can do some testing and things like that with it. And then, when you get towards the end of the sprint, then you do that merge back into, like I said, all the way to the end. Towards the end, you're going to just be focused on that release branch. All of your fixes, all of your individual developer branches at that point should be able to merge back in. That gives you that code freeze. Now you still have that release branch. You can branch off of that if you need to do a fix here or there and then merge that in. But then once it's complete, you merge it all the way, merge it back to your main branch, and then, branch off of that for the next version. And basically you'll see, within it, you see this sort of like roller coaster almost of, you have your main branch, and you'll see all these branches. You'll see a release branch come off of it. You see a bunch of release branches come off of that, but then they all merge back into the release branch. Release branch merges back into main, and start the cycle all over again. The nice thing about that is it does allow you to also, you could have multiple sprints working at a time. Now that, obviously the more you have going on, the more merge headaches you may run into. But again, it goes back to, if you're telling a story with each sprint, ideally what you would do is say, okay, let's say I've got 2 sprint teams working. Well, one is going to go do a sprint focused on the front end. And now the other one is going to focus on database related work. Ideally, and more often than not, there's no overlap in those 2 sprints. One group's going to go do all of their stuff, and when it merges, it's not going to have any effect on that other team that's working in that other area. If you've got something like that, if you're focused on what you're doing, hopefully, especially if your framework was designed, if your core foundation is built properly, there's not much, if any, overlap that needs to be done. I've got a project I'm working on right now that's actually the opposite of that, which drives me nuts, is that there's one file that basically has everything in it to some extent. It's got like everything touches it. And then also they didn't abstract certain environmental things properly. So every file has stuff that is specific to your environment, which means every time I check out, I've got like 20 files that I have to overlay with my version to be able to do my local development. And it means that every time I make basically every fix I've made, there's this one file I have to touch. So I have to make very sure that I commit only that hunk of code that I changed. There may be some other stuff out there, but I have to be very specific. And that means when the merge is done, the guy that does the merge has got like all these different versions of this file. That's all these things that are going on. And luckily it's usually like at a function level, but sometimes it's not. And so I know his merge headaches are more than they would need to be if it was designed, in quotes, correctly.
I see. Yeah, that's good.
And I think it definitely could be a presentation in itself on how to do a sprint. I've had some posts on it, and I think I even did a presentation way back sort of on that. But there is, it's a challenge because it's one of those things. I think there's a couple different ways to skin that cat, and a lot of it's going to deal with a lot of the best ways to do it, or what are going to be most effective, are almost a cultural kind of thing. And it also is it's the culture of the company and how it interacts. It's how the teams interact. It's the size of the teams. There's things that, like, there's a period where Michael and I were doing development, and it's just 2 people, and we sort of did what we just talked about. We'd branch on a release, branch for what we're working on, merge back. And it worked great. We moved along pretty well. However, if you take that and expand it to a 10-member team, then instead of merging 2 developers working on stuff, now you're merging 10. And if they're all working on sort of the same stuff, your merges can become very difficult. So, again, it goes back to you may want to there may need to be a better approach where you have some core branches off of that release branch that people are working on. So you're basically, so that you don't have to merge everything at once. It allows you to do more bite-sized merges, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that may be what you're running into. Maybe you've got something where it's just, there's so many changes going on that you have those headaches.
Yeah. I actually recently had a situation where I changed and kind of stepped on my own toes. I changed one file, trying to clean up code, and it's all in the same release or sprint. And then I actually implemented a feature that used that same file, and I added a single method to the file. But in changing the file and cleaning up the file, the class that is, when I brought it into the single release, how I instantiated things, whether it's auto-wired or manual instantiation, it just was not working together at all. So that type of thing has kind of been on my mind recently. What's the best way of implementing releases and releases in source or version control, so that that type of thing doesn't happen.
Yeah,
And I think you've answered that too, with just planning out the releases and the stories appropriately, so that those things don't happen.
Yeah, and as a sort of a slight side note on that, I use Git almost exclusively these days. There's not very many other version control types I've had to deal with, and it works well with this. One, when I go to a new release, when I've like fixed a branch, I will actually wipe stuff out. I will do like a complete pull of whatever the new branch is, because otherwise sometimes you'll have some stuff floating around that will cause some problems. The other thing is that I will have, typically if I've got any kinds of environmental stuff that is potentially being tracked in Git, I will actually set up my environment and I will stash my environment specific changes, and then just have that as like a run this every time kind of stash or something. So I can delete everything, I can pull, and then I can apply that stash, and it's going to put all of my environment specific changes into it. And I've found that more often than not is required, where you don't want to commit stuff that's got like your local directory structure and passwords and users and stuff like that. And but it's still sort of a problem at times because of the way things need to be stored for actual deployment. So, I think it's just one of those that each one's a little different, but once you figure out once you've stubbed your toe a couple of times, you learn not to kick that corner of the table, I guess. And it's just, again, it's where it's like, it's almost it's a personal and cultural kind of thing, depending on what you're working on and how those changes are coded and committed. Excellent question.
Well, thank you. That's an excellent response.
We'll just pat each other on the back all day long.
Yeah, I got a question for you, Rob.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I thought I was on mute. One thing I realized in Agile, usually you don't have these the UX designs. So how do the developers improvise with, because in Agile usually you just see the acceptance criteria, and then I'm a QA, so usually I wouldn't mind about the design and stuff like that. But usually, okay, acceptance criteria, this is how I'm looking for, these are my results, and this is what I'm gonna go by before I approve something. So on the developer side, how do you deal with that side of the UX design? Since there is no documentation, it's just maybe clips or post notes on the board.
That brings up a good point that I did not mention answering Timothy's question, is that another key part of Agile and going through that process properly is you should have code review within that. And that's usually going to be where you're going to pick up some of that UX stuff. There should be some sort of guidelines. There should be somewhere some developer guidelines of this is how we approach the user experience. These are standard fonts and colors and controls and things like that. There should be a standard look and feel to your application that you've laid out, whether it's maybe it's some initial framework kind of stuff where you've got like a couple clickable demo pages that you can use as a template for the look and feel, or a document that says this is, these are the things that we want to use and how stuff should look. Okay. And then within the review, that should be part of it. And ideally, it actually would be part of the QA review as well, is to say, okay, does this fit the look and feel of the application as it's progressing? Where it may not be an explicit acceptance criteria, but it would be something that I would think QA would raise to say, hey, this new page that you've created doesn't really look like any other page. Maybe it's not using stuff properly, or it doesn't have the right header or footer, or the menus aren't right, or things like that. That should be, although it may not be explicitly there, it wouldn't hurt to be. And actually, a lot of times when I've built scripts, when I've created test scripts for like UAT testing, or for people that it's like, hey, for testers where I want them to go in and verify stuff, that's going to be something I'm going to mention. It's going to be something along the lines of, check the header. Do the menus look right? Do you have the right menu options? Is the footer correct? Is the coloring is correct? Is the spacing? Is the layout? If we have to worry about mobile, is it responsive? Those kinds of things are just sort of like items that I put on whatever the feature is. It's like you should always test these things as well. So that shouldn't be ignored through Agile. There should be, with each of those, you should be building, again, you don't want to code yourself into a corner. So you should be building new pages and interfaces should fit with the style or the standards that have been laid out before that. At the beginning, all right, you may have some issues, but ideally you don't have like one sprint where all these different people are creating 15 different pages or forms or windows, and then have to find a way to coordinate those or commit those back to one standard look and feel. You should, before you get to that point, have some things to say, this is the standard look and feel, so they have something to work from. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. Thank you.
So what have we learned today? Ideally, Agile is a process. It's not an excuse to skip design or other pieces of software development. I see way too often that's how it's implemented, is that people say, oh, well, we can skip all of these pieces and we're going to they just turn it into a like code immediately and don't think about it approach. If you do that, you're just going to make things worse. That's not going to help anything. The thing to remember with the Agile process, again, looking back at the Agile Manifesto and their 12 core precepts, the goal is, it goes back to, as we've talked about all the time, providing solutions that are useful to your user. If you're coding just to code, if you're not coding to solve a problem, then you're not doing anything useful. You're just screaming in the wind or whatever it is. You're not helping anything. And so think about that with each sprint. And as you're building stuff, you're building a solution, you're solving problems. I think Agile really highlights that communication is a critical factor in successful software. If you're not talking to your users, if you're not communicating and listening to your users, then you're not going to get a solution that's going to be ideal or maybe even useful. You've got to have that rapport built between your development and your stakeholders, your end users, so that everybody is moving towards the same type of solution, the same solution. They're solving the same problems. All this, again, points to, even though Agile is a different way to approach software development, if you look at the best practices in a waterfall or Agile or any of the other processes that are out there, you're going to see that the same best practices exist throughout. You design, you think through a solution, you communicate with your end users, you get feedback, you test, you comment, all of that kind of stuff. There's different ways that and emphases on those different things, but those all exist. Those best practices are best practices. They exist no matter how you approach software development. And that brings us to the end of yet another thrilling and nail-biting presentation, as it were. As always, appreciate your time. Always love questions and comments on any of these things, whether it's this or any other presentation or post or podcast episode or whatever. You can shoot questions and comments to info@developerpreneur.com. You can check us out at developerpreneur.com. You can contact us on the Contact Us form. Follow us on Twitter @developerpreneur. We've got a Developerpreneur Facebook page, which also has some really regular posts there, mostly the podcasts and some of these videos. You can catch up if you're trying to find a way. Not mentioned here, but you can also check out our Vimeo channel and go to vimeo.com/developerpreneur. We got several dozen videos at this point that are out there on a wide variety of topics, because our goal is making every developer better. We're doing it every day, and we hope that you can join us on our journey. So have a good one.